Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast. Got an exciting topic that we're going to talk about this time. In fact, it parlays on our last episode where we talked about the lunar cycles. And Robert, in that episode, a couple of times we mentioned death, particularly related to the moon and how it can aspect things at various times. You got some emails, we got some questions about, well, okay, let's open up the big topic. How do you see death in an astrological chart?
Excellent question, and I think everybody is secretly interested in that. The question usually is, can you see when I'm going to die? And this poses right away an ethical question for an astrologer. What if you do see an early death or a predisposition toward it, so that the whole point of perhaps knowing that you're going to die an early death, I guess, is to get your affairs in order. A second reason you might want to know is there anything I can do about that? And of course, the answer is yes. And here's the truth. Every one of us are under potential death aspects about 3 times a year, and we don't die. The difference, for example, between being under a so-called death aspect and your life is sitting at a desk or selling retail or going to college, you're very unlikely to encounter perhaps the kind of stress that, say, you were under death aspects and fighting in a war somewhere, or being a police officer in a violent city, for example. Then suddenly it becomes a little more important. But ethically, think about it. Are you going to tell someone that they are likely to die at 45? You know? And why would you? And under what circumstances would you? So death is not nearly as predictable as people wish it were. Neither is astrology as predictable as people wish it were. I think most people expect this to be very much like a psychic, that, but this is scientific and mathematical, so this will absolutely tell me when I'm going to die. Well, what if you know that astrology has those same aspects 3 times a year? That's by transit. Now, if you're looking at something like solar arc, suddenly you're working with astrology at a little bit different level, because solar arc aspects only happen once in a lifetime. They never repeat. So if you're under a death aspect in a solar arc, it might be more likely under a solar arc aspect. With my own, for example, years and years ago, my nephew actually asked me, can you see when you're going to die? My doctor said the same thing. My doctor happens to be a woman from India, so she's very familiar with astrology. She had an astrologer as a girl. And she asked me, once she found out what I do for a living, she said, can you read your own heart? I said, of course. And she said, can you see how long you'll live? And I said, well, I have a ballpark. And she said, how old? And I said 92, and it's a solar arc aspect involving my son. And at 92, well, as I said to her, you and I both know I could get hit by a Mack truck when I leave here today. But if we do everything right, the two of us, I as the patient and you as the doctor, then I will live to be 92, or perhaps even longer. And she looked at me and said, you know something, you will make it. And I said, what? She said, Bob, you're over 70. You've never had any cardiovascular disease. You've never had any cancer. Statistically, you have another 20 years. So it was wonderful to hear that from a doctor. So I have predicted death maybe 5 or 6 times in 50 years, 56 years, whatever it is now. And never for the person themselves, always for another party, and only in situations where I, as an astrologer, thought it was ethical to do it. One of the classic examples I use, Thomas, is a woman who phoned me. I was in New York on business, and she was in California, and I didn't have her horoscope, and this was in the days before computers and cell phones. She phoned me in New York, and on the phone, she said, can you see anything about my My sister in Florida, she has been a chronic alcoholic all of her life. She's been staying with a couple in Florida, but they can't handle her anymore. And that will mean that I'm going to have to find a residence, a home for my sister. And to do that, because of the expense involved, means I have to sell the family property in Florida. Well, I didn't have her horoscope, and I said, let me call you back in about a half an hour. So I set up an horary chart, and it said that the sister was very likely to die in about 1 month. So I phoned her, and it also did not look like she would have to sell the property. So I called her back and told her that on the phone. I said, can you wait just a month until the beginning of May? Because I think this situation will pretty much take care of itself. And I really don't think you're going to have to sell the family property. And she said, you're saying she's going to die in May? And I said, I can't say that. But what I am saying is that I think the situation will resolve itself around the 1st of May, which it did. Her sister did die. So in those types of situations, I'm perfectly comfortable in dealing with death because it's a legitimate question, I think. I've also had situations, can you see when my husband's father is going to die? Because when he does, he will leave us all his money. That's not a legitimate question to me. And in that situation, I remember I was reading for the wife. And I said to her, you think that if your husband's father, your father-in-law, dies and leaves you all this money, that it's going to save this marriage. It won't. The marriage is in trouble no matter what the money situation is. You think also that if you have a baby, it's going to save this marriage. It won't. The marriage needs work, regardless of these financial aspects. So it's not nearly as necessary in truth in astrology to be able to predict death. And then second of all, it's dangerous to do because what if you're wrong? Then you've set up an aura of fear in the person. Oh, this guy told me I was likely to die when I'm 45. Well, what's the good in saying that to somebody, even if it's true, you see? What's the good of it? On the other hand, if somebody has a serious illness, then you can certainly look at the various potentials for the prognosis of the outcome. So this question about death and dying is not something to be taken like a little parlor trick. It's fraught with, and not only is it fraught with psychological issues, it's fraught with legal issues as well. You can get into serious trouble as an astrologer by trying to get too detailed with medical advice or medical treatment, even though you can certainly do on a very general level, you can do a lot with astrology and health. But these are really tricky questions that have a lot of ethical concerns under them. I hope this is making some sense.
Well, it brings the question that unless somebody has the level of experience like that you do, is it something best just to stay away from?
In general, I think so. I really do. For example, you can look at the 8th house in your birth chart for indications about how you will die. The ruler of the 8th, and so on. And you can also look at the 4th, which is the end of the matter. I think it was Mark Edmund Jones' book, where he distinguishes the 8th house, the house of transformation, if you will, has a lot to do with the dying process, and so does the 9th. And you and I, you've been in workshops, I think, with me, where we have found Jupiter, which is the natural 9th house ruler of Sagittarius. We've found that Jupiter plays often a very prominent role in deaths. I think if for no other reason than death is certainly the longest journey we will ever make. And having had near-death experiences myself, it really is a journey, and the soul, in my experience, does not die. In fact, I've been listening to some YouTube videos about a group of scientists at the University of Virginia, for example, and these are all psychiatrists and medical doctors talking about near-death experiences and what they have learned about them. So there are various ways to approach death. Mark Edmund Jones talks about death in the 8th house versus the disposition of the body, which is the 4th house, the final resting place, the end of the matter, and so on. And then, too, the 6th house and the 8th house are both in conjunct the ascendant. And the in conjunct aspect itself is an aspect about health. It's about dis-ease, a state of dis-ease between two planetary archetypes. So both of those houses, the sixth and the eighth, figure into death. So you already begin to get the idea. This is not nearly as simple as finding one little indication and saying, okay, this is where you're going to die. It's not that simple, nor should it be.
I believe, too, personally, exactly what you said at the beginning, that we have various windows of opportunity for our soul to conveniently exit if it wants. And those appear all the time. We have multiple opportunities to check out.
I totally agree. And second of all, for example, when I got into astrology at 20, just before I was 21, and the very first book that I picked up said, you need to be very careful of alcohol and yada, yada, yada. And I thought, oops. Because as you know, I come out of an alcoholic family. I was drinking then and thought that was just fine. That was what everybody did. But it brought me up short, astrology. It said, you better watch out for this. And thank heaven for astrology, I would be dead without it. So I realized, all right, if this horoscope, this old book is telling me, my horoscope tells me I have an alcohol problem, I guess I better pay attention to this, which of course I did. So in that sense, I'm very conscious that I, through astrology, have been awakened enough to pay attention, real attention, to how I am responsible for my own health and my own death in that sense. I want a very easy death. My mother had one. She died in her sleep. I probably will too. The sun, death, conjunct Neptune, of sleep, in the 9th house of astral travel. And that's exactly how I want to die.
There you go.
Is just leave the body very consciously. I don't want to be under drugs unless I'm in severe pain and suffering. I'd just as soon not have any pharmacological intervention between me and dying. But so you can begin to get ideas about it. But more importantly, I think you get an idea from your horoscope about it. Look, here is how you are undermining your own life, your own health. And it's absolutely going to affect you unless you do something about it, which I think is the whole message of astrology anyway. What can I do to correct this? Or what can I do to lift my understanding of this aspect or that aspect?
Now, if you'd like to follow along with this question, go to the show notes and you can download Robert's natal chart, which we talk about here. What is it in your solar arc chart, as you bring that piece into this, that tipped you off to 92 as opposed to...
I have forgotten, but let me just show you from my natal chart, since we're looking at that right now. I have my sun at 8.5 Libra. So let's add 92 to that and see. I've forgotten, really. 92 and 8 is 100. So 100 Libra is the same as 70 Scorpio, is the same as 40 Sagittarius, is the same as 10 Capricorn. That's what it was. And you see, that's the year that my solar arc sun, the ruler of my death house, my 8th house, conjuncts my ascendant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Got it?
Yep, exactly.
So very quick, very down and dirty, and that was it. So I looked at that, and, 92.
But right. It does that every year. Oh, no. Okay.
No.
I see solar arc. Solar arc.
Only once in a lifetime that happens.
Not transit.
Not transit. Oh, no.
Yeah, because
transit would, the sun conjuncts it every year. But in solar arcs, it only forms that conjunction with my ascendant once, and that is age 92.
Well, and it would be a glorious send-off then, too. And this is a good point to break in here, and I'm going to tell you that this concludes the astrological analysis of where to find death in a chart. But this podcast goes for another 16 minutes or so, with Robert and me just talking about death and concepts around death, but not astrologically. So if you're just here for the astrology, this is a good place to jump off. You won't miss anything. If you'd like to just hear a context conversation around all of this, then feel free to continue. We do have a really cool video at the end, also, which there's a link in the show notes. It absolutely
Except for one thing. Now, over the last, 7 years, I keep reading about men, particularly men usually die before women statistically, but I keep reading about men who are not only past 90, but there are a few even over 100 who still work.
Yes.
And there's a lawyer in New York, in Manhattan, who's 98, still goes into his office every day to work. And I realize what they have in common, Thomas. They all love what they do for a living, and they all work for themselves.
Yes. You're right.
And when I look at my life, that's exactly what I've done all my life. I've followed my bliss, knowing full well it was not likely to be very stable. But boy, oh boy, is it enriching. And it turns out the irony now at this age is that it is very stable. So I keep saying astrology pays off in so many ways. And now I see these guys living longer than 92, and I'm thinking, who knows? If I do reach 92, I may change my mind. I may like to go a little longer.
Hey, my inspiration on that was a guy by the name of Klaus Obermeyer, still alive, in Aspen. So there's an Obermeyer ski company. A lot of people are familiar with it. They make ski wear, clothing. He started that company back in the 70s, I believe. And still to this day, this man at 102, his main form of exercise is swimming at the rec center in Aspen. And then in the wintertime, he, at least when I was there, this was a couple of years ago, would ski a couple of runs several times a week over at Buttermilk, which is the easier slope. But the man
How old was he?
Still, at that time, 199.
Skiing?
Skiing.
God
He was an Olympic level skier back in the day. So he had the skill. But he still went to work every day. Now he didn't run the company, obviously, but he still was in that office.
Yeah.
And you know what? The other secret about Klaus Obermeyer, you never see the man without a big smile on his face. He's always beaming from ear to ear.
Well, Thomas, I think you've kind of hit the nail on
the
head.
That's what I say. He's my avatar.
Yeah.
He really is.
This is the one thing about my life that I truly never anticipated, even though I had read this about Capricorn rising, long, long ago, about the older you get, the happier you'll get, and the more successful or whatever. And okay, that's easy enough to read and think, yeah, right, when you're 20, because you're not thinking about getting older. But I have been consciously aware for at least the last 7 years now, and it's just ongoing. I have never in my life been so happy, so continuously in my life. And I've had a lot of wonderful things in my life. I've been as happy, but not on a continual basis. My metabolism psychologically today is happy. It's amazing to me because I'm not used to it. I'm used to it being continuous, except over 7 years, thank heaven, I am consciously aware of it and incredibly grateful for it. And I mean in every single way, physically, financially, spiritually, intellectually. I love what I do. I love my life. It's amazing to me to be this. And I have friends dropping like flies. They're all terrified of death and dying. And I go, well, okay. And I understand it. But that hasn't been my life. It's been this kind of spiritual quest that has, brought me these experiences and insights that make the difference, I think, between fearing death and sort of looking forward to it.
I'll tell you what, I narrated an audiobook. I've done all these audiobooks for author Fred Dodson. And the last one of the initial bunch, we had done, 15, 20. I've recorded over 30 for him now, so it's hard to remember. But at least over 20 audiobooks that we had recorded. And then he said, here, I want you to do this one. It's my least selling book, but here, go ahead and record it. And I emailed him back. I said, Fred, that's the best book you've written. Why did you hold this till last? And I've been a big advocate of it all the way since. It's called Lives of the Soul, Lives, Lives of the Soul. And the book basically starts at death and talks about what happens in between incarnations. For those of you familiar with Michael Newton's work, it would be parallel similar to that. But I recommend that especially if people are either A, afraid of death, or B, have recently lost a loved one. It is such a comfort to understand this perspective. And Michael Newton's work on this came from some 10,000 scientifically documented hypnotherapy cases.
Mm-hmm.
Common themes that came up from all kinds of different people, different, obviously, male, female, different socioeconomic, different ethnic backgrounds, all these same themes, religious backgrounds. Here was the pattern. And that's exactly what that material is about. And it's a short book, so you can get through it in about 4 hours and you're done. And you have this incredible background or basis of information on why we don't fear it. And also you totally will understand how we have these little portals to snap out. And I'll tell you, I've got a theory, Robert. I don't know what you think about this, but with everything that's been going on since the pandemic, I think a lot of souls have opted to pluck out. Like they're like, oh, heck no, I'm not hanging around for this. They're like, I'm out. And I think, too, that a lot of those souls are leaving so that they can help us from the other side because they can contribute more from the non-physical realm than they can from the physical realm.
I totally agree with all that. And you remind me of something else. Philosophically, Seth, Jane Roberts, The Nature of Personal Reality, the Seth books,
absolutely,
is far from the first one to say this, because you can go back to Plato and get the same thing. But he states it more succinctly than probably anybody I've ever read. One of the statements, I think it's either in Seth Speaks or The Nature of Personal Reality, you are as dead now as you will ever be. Think about it. And then you get into philosophers talking about, especially you get into the Tibetan Book of the Dead and so on. This is how ancient all this is. People often they're not aware that they're dead. They still think they're alive for a while. Until things begin to happen. It reminds me of the movie The Sixth Sense with Bruce Willis, and if you saw that film,
I didn't see it.
Well, I don't want to spoil it for you.
I won't have time. Go ahead and spoil it.
Well, he's a child psychologist, and one of his patients is played by Haley Joel Osment, who was not only one of the best child actors in cinema history, he's one of the best actors ever, and he's treating this boy who sees dead people. And his mother's very concerned about it. And throughout the film, things happen that convince the mother that he's telling her the truth. And finally, at the end of the movie, the big reveal is that Bruce Willis is dead. He's always been dead in this movie.
I love that.
Which, for me, Thomas, I've had since that car accident and the out-of-body experience I had then that led to 4 more within that 1 year. I've really not had any more since that 1 year, but I have vivid dreams, for example, very different from an out-of-body experience. But through the 5, including the accident, 5 out-of-body experiences I had, I really became convinced that it is true what they say, is that you, meaning your soul, you don't die physically. You don't.
No, I agree.
And for that reason, I'm not afraid of it at all. And then plus, I think I've told you, and maybe we've mentioned this in the podcast, Steve Jobs' sister, the founder of Apple, when he was dying of pancreatic cancer in the hospital, she was there holding his hand, and she wrote an article about this for Esquire. And as he died, he shut his eyes. He was still gripping her hand, and he said, "Oh, wow," whatever it was he was seeing. And then she describes how his grip lessened, and he said it a second time, and finally a third time. "Oh, wow." And then he died. So who knows what he was seeing? But having had these out-of-body experiences myself, I think, of course, that would be it. Of course, it's incredible.
Yeah, that's what Fred picks up on Lives of the Soul is typically, often, those who have gone before us in their soul form, but in a way that we can connect with in our physicality, appear first to greet us.
To guide us, absolutely.
Yeah. So
My own mother, before she died, about 6 months before, had called me to see if I could come over. It sounded like something was wrong. And she says, no, nothing's wrong. I'll explain when you get here. Got there, and she started telling me about these hallucinations, that she was 80. And the minute I hear hallucinations at that age, my father had the same things, I think they're in the process of dying. And it was really poetic but she was seeing the same thing, the people coming in to surround her and so on. And she did die in her sleep, which I think is a wonderful way to go. She worked the last day of her life and went home, went to bed, and died in her sleep. And I would like to do the same thing, work until I drop.
Exactly.
Because I love what I do.
Yeah.
That's the only reason.
Yeah. Yeah. Same here. Same here. Exactly. We're of the same mind of that. Well, let's boil this down to some takeaways here. So takeaway number one is we have multiple opportunities, and that's just part of life. That's just built into the system. Yes, the chart reflects those possibilities, just like it reflects other possibilities. And then you had gone through some of the areas that we might look if we wanted to look into that. But maybe if you're not on the level of Robert's level of experience, that might be something not to explore without that background. Is that a pretty good summary?
I think that's really fair. And also, I think it depends on the intent. Why do you want to know? If why you want to know is just a parlor trick, a fortune-telling trick, good luck. Because you won't take the time to study the chart as thoroughly as if you have a really serious need to know. My grandfather was taken into ICU. He's had a massive stroke. The doctors want to take him off of food and water for 6 days because they want to examine the brain tissue. I'm afraid if they do that, it will kill him. My brother and sister want to do what the doctors say. Can you see anything? That's a totally legitimate question.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I answered it.
Family decision.
And it was right. So it depends on your intent, I think. If you're just playing around with astrology, you deserve what you get.
Well, and the other thing that I've seen too is where astrologers will dissect somebody's death chart the day they died, and you can see the pieces fit together. So the chart will illustrate often a death, but using that looking forward is, why not live to the fullest, as you say, and then when our soul is ready to leave, just always be ready for it to leave. It's all good.
True. And two, I think it's maybe more important sometimes to be able to see when a person is going to experience the death of others. And I get this often, depending on the ages of the client, but it will often show that a parent, for example, is likely to have a period here of some serious health issues. I think I was just yesterday talking with a client about her mother, and I just flat said, is she already in dementia? Have you seen any evidence? Yes, indeed, she already was. So that alone confirms, because she had a real need to know about her mother. So I was able to tell her that it looks like within the next year and a half, that you will have to be deciding whether she can remain in this house that she's been in all her life, or if you and your sister will have to find some more palliative care for her in a different facility, and therefore decide what to do with this property. So there are reasons to know, and I'm not predicting the mother's death, but I am acknowledging that astrology shows she is likely to have dementia and to be in decline, and gave her a little more than that in terms of when. So there are many situations, I guess, where it can be valuable to have an idea. But if it's just a kind of game to test astrology or just to make a little fortune-telling prediction, then you're not likely to be successful with it.
All right, let me ask you about readings, because you are booking readings. If somebody came to you and said, Robert, as part of my reading, I would like you to tell me what my chart looks like as far as death. Is that something you would do, or would you advise maybe?
It depends. It really does depend on the person, but up to a point, I'd be happy to talk about it. Just like with mine, I can look and see my own death is very likely to be a stroke, or a heart attack.
Yeah. Sun, Neptune.
Either one of which is okay with me. I think strokes are less painful. But I will probably be, because Thomas, from the accident that I was in, where the car was hit on my side, started rolling over into oncoming traffic doing 45 miles an hour. The minute the car started rolling over, that's where I heard myself say, oh, here's where you die. Here's where I die. And I just shut my eyes to die. There was no fear at all. And I was 30 feet over the car, and later realized how wonderful to know, because I could have been really severely injured, paralyzed, or anything else. The roof over where I'd been sitting over the passenger seat had crushed into the seat of the car. I was thrown in the back of this little Volkswagen station wagon. I was completely unhurt. But I realized my soul saw, this is where you could die and be severely hurt. And I was instantly out of my body.
I found the coolest video online just in the last couple of weeks. I'll try to put a link to it here on the show notes, but it's an accident scene at night, and there's a emergency life flight helicopter that's just firing its blades up to lift off, and the patient who was in the car accident dies right at takeoff. And you can see this white puff go up just as the helicopter's lifting off the ground. There's an arrow pointing to it. I'll try to put it in the show notes. What a cool video, and it just shows you that instantly we are in another realm, we're in another form, and we're going on to whatever is beyond here. Mm-hmm. Just that effortlessly.
I totally agree. There's absolutely a non-physical reality, and it pre-exists physical reality. We pre-exist physical reality.
Well, thank you for exploring this topic with us. It's I know it's delicate, and some people wince when the topic comes up, but I hope that this has at least helped show that the chart, speaks to it, but we have many, many opportunities and possibilities of how we're going to exit this life. If you'd like to sit with Robert with your chart one-on-one, he is available, and the information on how to do that, link to it, is in the show notes, as well as hopefully this video that I can find for you. And we will see you back next time on Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast with Robert Glasscock. Thanks for listening.